We're starting here. We want to welcome everybody to our monthly engineering webinar. And this is our webinar for February. We actually delayed it a week because we were actually involved in a radio class last week. And we couldn't do the webinar, but we're glad to have you with us today. This webinar is actually sponsored by sponsored by Max Connect Group. Having trouble talking this morning. I had too much coffee. Max Connect Group, they're our sponsor for this, not only the webinar, but also the Engineering Academy and the other activities that we do there at the ABA. And if you haven't checked with them, make sure you do that, www.maxconnect.com. They have some interesting products and services available, so we encourage you to do that. This webinar is being recorded and we'll have it archived up on the YouTube site, ABA Engineering Academy. So if you have to leave early or somebody else wants to watch it, it will be up there sometime later this afternoon. Well, we're excited to have with us today one of my really good friends that I've known for a long time, and Frank Foti. He's with Telos, and Frank, I think you've been sort of known around the world as Mr. Omni, I think. And I asked Frank if he would join us today to talk about audio processing. I know everybody knows everything about processing or should know everything about processing, but sometimes we'll get bogged down, and you can really make the modern day processors can really sound really good if you adjust them correctly. However, if you adjust them wrong, then sometimes you can destroy it. So Frank, first of all, welcome to the program, and let's talk a little bit about processing today.
Larry, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to spend time with your group, and it's always, through the years, you and I share communications from time to time about either audio processing or transmission systems and things of that nature. And, hopefully we'll have an enjoyable time today. I think, me too. I think there's something wrong with the 1956 jaw today. So,
well, I think one of the things I wanted to touch on, and I'd like to get your thought in it. I've seen several webinars and seminars, especially from the pro audio side, where people are talking about how important it is to get everything right at the source before you start doing things downstream. And I think that really ties into audio processing in broadcast stations, that if you don't have things right ahead of the processor, then you don't put a processor in the rack to clear up problems that you have ahead of time. And this goes for quality and levels and stuff like that. So what are your thoughts about getting things right at the source?
Well, I'll make an analogy. And since it's time for spring training, let's talk baseball. They talk about the top of the lineup, your leadoff hitter. And if you have a good leadoff hitter, and they get on base, good things are going to happen, for the team that's batting, right? Well, getting the audio right at the source is like having that leadoff hitter. And in today's day and age, and I'm not going to assume that, everyone here is, operating a digital facility. But when I look back on my career in the day-to-day trenches of radio, I recall learning at a young age from my mentor, Jim Samich, who used to say, my nickname in the radio station was Foti. It was like a stretching of my last name. He'd say, Foti, if we don't get it right at the source, we're shooting, we're basically hitting ourselves in the face, because, and this meant, back then, this was a day of, this was working at WMMS where we were playing, record albums. So we made sure that everything was top notch, from the turntable to the cartridges, to the styluses, to, the electronics that was in the audio console. And I remember, in the audio console, we had, it still had some, not so nice transformers. We took them out and built our own, op amp, balanced outputs. And I will tell you this, we heard a difference on the radio. So there's that. And then everything, all your source material, the better it can be, the better off you're going to be. In today's world, and 15 years ago, when we started using digital source material, there was all this, discussion, and I don't say controversy, about using data reduced or MP3 files, low bitrate MP3 files. Well, in today's world, with storage, memory storage being very inexpensive and in high volume, the ability to, to use lossless files or WAV files should be considered, because if you're going to take and play some MP3 file that's, maybe 128, 192 kilobits, and, stick it down the pipe and then try to, crank on it in the audio processor, there's a chance you're going to hear some things you're not going to like. And as you say, it's trying to fix things that are broken going in is not that easy. Now, that said, we do have some tools in the toolbox, like, declipping, which can fix many things, not everything, but many things. And we can try to restore some dynamics if something's been pre-processed improperly. But for the most part, Larry, is if the facility, if everything coming into the audio processor is as best as it can be electrically, then chances are, however you wish to set up the processing, that should print well on the radio.
Yeah, that our good friend Andrew Shep talks about that all the time. When he's doing a recording or laying down some tracks, if you don't get the source material right, then you're just working yourself to death to try to get it right in the mix and everything else. So
in the good old days, and this goes back to, let's say, the mid to the late 70s. There's two songs that come to mind that had recording defects in them. One is Thunder Road by Bruce Springsteen. And you can tell if you take an old copy of the album or the early release of the CD, just as Bruce goes to sing, you hear like a 60 cycle hum come in at a very low level. Now, remasters, they've cleaned that up. And then the other one was Chucky's in Love by Ricky Lee Jones. Same thing, right where her vocal comes in, where they probably punch it in, there's a whistle in the background. And then I know that in later releases, they went back in the studio and probably used some notch filter to get rid of it. But I say that while that was source material, if there's little things like that are in the transmission path that are part of the studio or what have you, if it's getting in there on the air, you're kind of, again, using the baseball analogy or the new pitch clock, you're going up there with a no ball and one strike count on you. So the better you can have it from the get-go, the better the chances are you're going to have it, printing on the radio in the way that you want it to be.
Yeah, it seems that defects like that, sometimes they sort of compound themselves throughout. If you have little things happening along the stage going into before it gets to the processor, they sort of compound. I know Bob Katz mentioned that one time. He said the reason that digital audio doesn't really sound as good as it should is because people or engineers have not taken the time to look under the hood to see how digital works, and they make fundamental mistakes and they compound themselves, and at the end it sounds terrible. So you're exactly right. Little things like that can build up in the chain all the way from the source material right to the input. So we want to get that clean.
And Larry, speaking of and probably supporting some of what Bob is saying, Bob Katz, is in the digital facility, if within your plant there's a lot of sample rate converting going on, up and down, and not knowing what sample rate converter chips or algorithms are being used. Some are better than others, and it's the same with with the whole codec world. I mean, in the early days, when I say early days, I'm talking about the early 90s when codecs first came into play. Steve Church and I would spend the time to, because to evaluate audio coming through codecs, because if somebody wasn't using, let's say, a standardized decoder, software for, like in this case, it would have been like from Fraunhofer. Well, if somebody was, doing a homebrew decoder, things just didn't sound the same. And, that A to D and D to A chips, all of this stuff matters. Now, my saying this, I'm not expecting that when we're done, with our seminar, that everyone's going to go and, dig out the manuals and start looking at, at the schematics of like, what D to A chip do we have in this, or A to D converter, or what sample rate converter? But because most manufacturers that are, making digital equipment, they're using good stuff. That I can tell you. But if you're mixing and matching various things, you want to pay attention to, pay attention to the digital path. You want to pay attention to where is full scale. I mean, that's another thing that people get tripped up on in the digital world. There is no plus 3 dB FS, plus 3 dB full scale. I mean, 0 dBFS is 0 dBFS. And if you try to go beyond that, really bad things happen. Yes, you get square waves, but you get aliasing components. And that's not a good thing. So try to think, you should think of 0 dBFS as the same as what would have been the clip point in your analog console. Right. And if your analog console was running a bipolar power supply of plus and minus 15 volts, well, you can, do the simple math to determine, hey, this is the max level, audio level that the console could pass. That would be the equivalent of your full scale, because in essence, in that case, it's analog full scale, and 0 dBFS in the digital world is unforgiving. So as long as you can probably, build in a headroom of, let's say, 20 dB, to be normal operating level using the VU meter, you're good.
Yeah, I think what I've heard over the past few years is to try to do your peak levels should be minus 12, should be the maximum. That gives you 12
Right.
dB of headroom. Because the old joke was that I heard that when you hit 0 dBFS, all the bits in that word, regardless of whether it's 16-bit, 24, 32, whatever it happens to be, all the bits are ones. And you've run out of ones, and you can't go to Radio Shack and buy another sack of ones.
That's right.
They're all gone. So
that's right.
That's something they really have to do. Well, assuming that we get our audio the way it's supposed to be, sort of walk us through how you would set up from scratch a brand new processor that you put in the chain.
Okay. First of all, if we're thinking about in the world of today, basically all the beasts, and I say that lovingly, are generally digital, and they've got setup screens and, quick starts or quick tweaks and things of that nature. But before we get there, I think the thing that I would like to share, and I don't say impress, but try to use influence on, is before you get started, get an idea what the end result is, what the end goal is, and who is the person that is going to make that decision. A bit of history from my own past. When I began in business, while I was making little, homebrew hot rod audio processors, I was doing a moderate amount of consulting to broadcast stations. And the first thing I would do is, somebody would fly me in, and I'd sit down and I'd say, okay, gang, who's got the final say on setting the processing. And whenever I got the following response, I knew we were in trouble. Oh, we have a committee that does that. Oh, really? Well, committees, I mean, they're great, but it's rare that you get a committee that's all going to say we want the same thing, because we all hear a little differently. We all claim that, oh yeah, we want to be loud, clean, with a lot of punch. Well, each of those descriptors may mean something different to each of the people saying that. So I can't say strongly enough that you need to have one person who's the final say. It can sometimes it's usually the program director. Some on occasion it's the chief engineer or maybe the station manager. Doesn't matter who it is. But going back to my example, I would get, I'd say, okay, gang, I'm sorry, we can't have a committee. Who is it? Who's and if the rest of you want to influence, that's fine, but we need one person. Once we get that and we get an understanding what they're looking for, then now we can get with the box or the system, because it's, some cases it's software. We could start tweaking. And again, it's not like, hey, let's just go in there and start twisting knobs. I would say the best thing is if somebody says, hey, we've got an adult contemporary radio station. We want it to be on the dial. We don't want to fall off compared to the competition. We want to be careful of women listening, but we want a nice, warm, full sound. Okay. Most products today will have a list of presets, and those are generally a starting point. Please don't think that, because an Omnia or this or that has this preset, that it's the be all end all. Once in a while it is, but generally speaking, it's a starting point. So put that on the radio, or set it up to where, and usually what I did was, I didn't just blindly go on the radio. I set it up in what I would call like a closed loop listening environment, where I could A/B to what's on the air in a closed loop listening environment. And what do I mean by that? What I would do is I had my mod monitor where I could have it to either listen off the air, take the RF feed, or take a composite input. And the composite input, I would route from a composite switcher. And this is in a case where I was sending composite, to the transmitter. And then that composite switcher would switch between what was feeding air, which I'd bridged off of, or the system under test. And then I could listen to that on a set of monitors that I trusted. And I would start that way. I'd say, okay, how are we comparing to what's on the air right now? Is it better? Is it worse? Is it the same? Is it meeting the goal we want to have? And I would start that way. Reason being is, if I screwed something up, it's not printing on the radio. I'm not running the risk of somebody come running into the wherever it is or calling, today, screaming at you on a cell phone, or, hey, you're screwing up the sound of the station. That's how I always started. Now, I realize in some cases you may not have those resources where you can, have switch in and out in a private, situation. If that's not the case, I would try to set something up, or if you're putting in a new system, there's a good chance you have an older system that's there. You would try to set up an A/B switch where you can switch, one against the other to compare and listen. And again, once you've set all your proper levels, input and output, so that, when you switch, the new system on the air, all of a sudden the modulation doesn't drop, too much or go over too much. You want to know you've got, the right levels. And again, easy to do. I still live and breathe, it's sitting right here. I'm in the room that I do a lot of my development work. I still believe in this thing, an oscilloscope. It's one of the newer ones that's digital based, but I'm working out of the home office today, but downtown in my lab at the Telos Alliance, I've got a good old analog, HB scope that, I trust that more than anything else. So I get all my levels correct. And then, and I try to set up some way where I can A/B up either against what's on the air now. And then once I, start to get happy, or the people I'm working with, just using myself as an example here, then we can start doing the proverbial, how do we sound up against the competition? Because that's going to factor into the equation.
Well, when you're speaking of the presets that come in most processors now, would it be safe to say that if you were a particular format, you might find another format setting that sounds better than, it's just that maybe modern country, it may sound, that preset may sound better on an urban. It just is that correct? And
Larry, it is correct. And remember, they're all starting points. They're I don't want to say they're generic, but I guess maybe in a way they are. They're a generic starting point. And I can only speak from my own experiences, but it's based on, trying to get an idea, like, if we're talking country, okay, I'll try to get a collection of wide ranging, I still use CDs, of CDs of, older country to modern country, because, and I'm not just talking about the style of music, but the way the stuff's recorded, the way Waylon Jennings was done is a lot different than, Jason Aldean has been recorded today. And it's the same with, most formats, maybe with the exception of like classical music. Classical music, is generally recorded pretty much the same throughout the world. So, again, we're trying to get something that's appealing to that genre of programming content. But yes, to your point, just because it may say, country hot doesn't mean you can't, try something from album rock or CHR or something else, to that effect.
yeah, John Cooper, the reason I brought that up, John Cooper, who's a front of house mixer for Bruce Springsteen, talks about plugins. And he said the presets on plugins, just because it says it's for a electric guitar, doesn't mean that it doesn't work good on a snare drum. Try these different things and see which one seems to fit your, and that would be the same thing in broadcasting. See
Exactly.
how it sounds. And you were speaking about your setup and listening to it in monitor speakers. I think the key thing, and I think you'd agree on that, is know your monitor speakers, understand those, know how they're supposed to sound. And I've always liked to use reference material, that how that reference material, and that helps you understand how your speakers are actually responding. Then you can go back to your stuff that you're doing, and you've got a reference to go by.
Oh yeah,
if you don't know that. Yeah.
Larry, that's a great point, because I believe that every broadcast facility needs to have a reference monitoring location, and not just for audio processing. One of the, it'll always be there because of the way, the RF signal leaves the antenna. But, if you're trying to evaluate for multipath or the tuning of the transmitter and things of that nature, all of that matters. So having a reference monitoring location is, I think, paramount. And that location needs to have as good an RF sampled signal as possible. Obviously, you can take an RF feed out of the sample from the transmitter and bring it in, but in many cases, most transmitter sites, although more of the current units are much quieter today, I've always found that, like, some off-site location where I have a known good RF signal that's like void of multipath, or it virtually has no multipath. My days at Z100, I had like the perfect monitor location, which was the studios out in Secaucus, New Jersey, because there was nothing in the line of sight between I think 3.5 miles from where the studio was and the Empire State Building. And I had a multipath indicator. And I mean, there was like nothing there. So I was able to listen to not only, our signal, but basically the entire New York, all the signals in New York, and have a really good off-air sampling. So I had a good print of what was going on the radio on a day-to-day basis. And I think if you don't have something like that, please consider finding one, because that will help in this whole process, what we're talking about today.
You've mentioned in the past about the way that you set the controls in a processor up, and there's tons of them if you really want to do delve down into the inside and make all these adjustments. And you've always talked about that you can't do it in 30 minutes, or you can't do it in an hour or a day. And this is where the presets come in, because I think most all processors now allow you to save the adjustments that you've had and name it whatever you want to, so you can go back and A/B it to see, well, did the adjustment I made yesterday, did it go in the right direction or the wrong direction? And talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Something that is very important is that our ears can become fatigued very quickly. I generally will try to rest my ears after about 20 minutes. And I'm not talking about 20 minutes of listening to loud audio. I mean, I have to admit, I being an old rock and roller, I enjoy feeling it, but it's easy to fatigue the ears. And another thing is, especially if you're in a case where setting up processing for competitive loudness, you got to be even more careful. And the reason being is, you're getting these sound pressure levels that are getting higher and higher and more constant. I'm using my hand as almost like the mod monitor. It looks like it almost becomes like a current monitor on the transmitter. What ends up happening is, and I've used this analogy before with regard to the sound of processing, but with respect to fatigue, think about the following. And I think we've all done this, right? Go to the sink and turn the hot water key on and let it get really, really hot. Okay. Then take your finger and just keep poking at the hot water, as I'm doing here on the screen. Well, if you do it like this, every time you touch the water, it's hot, because the nerves are, it's like it feels the hot, then you pull it out and it recovers. Hot, recovers. If you take your finger and stick it under the hot water, for the first few seconds, it's going to be hot, but then the nerves desensitize and doesn't feel hot anymore, because your nerves have equalized. The ears do the exact same thing. By example, I recently was finishing up a project working on headphones, where I was trying to come up with an algorithm, and I did, of trying to, headphones is like two-dimensional listening, left, right, and then what gets stuck in the middle of your head. And I was working on something to try to recreate the 3D effect that we get from listening with speakers, make it easier to listen to. And the reason I bring this up is that I could only do it for about 15 minutes at a time, because I could feel my head and my ears like becoming desensitized. So I would take it off, I'd turn everything off. And if I was working here at home, I'd go down the basement, putz around with the little trains for a little bit, maybe half hour or so, then I'd come back. And I found that my ears were fresh. It's the same thing here. Now, to what you're talking about, Larry, the same thing of where, we have the ability to be able to make some adjustments, save something, A/B against what we saved, or other settings from, if let's say the system's been on the air for a while and we're just making processing changes over time, it's easy to go back and, say, oh, how did this sound? How did that sound? And obviously you get the immediate results.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that about listener fatigue because I'm pretty involved in pro audio and watch a lot of things from Andrew and Chris Lloyd Alge and people like that. I know that Chris said that he runs when he's mixing, he runs it at such a low level that he can still carry on a conversation with somebody sitting next to him because of your ears will trick you. And what you're actually hearing is not really what the processor's doing.
Larry, there's a fella, sadly, this guy was a program director and a very well-known voiceover talent for many years. His name was Mark Driscoll. And Mark programmed a lot of radio stations. And I got to know Mark through my time in New York. And then later on, he programmed a number of radio stations and he'd fly me in and I'd work with him. Mark had, and this is where I learned that you talk about the low volume. The way Mark would evaluate the processing is we'd go out in his car and we'd be just talking like we are here, right? And he'd have the radio on at a really low level. And while we were talking, he'd be punching back and forth. And to him, it was the ability to discern the sound at a low level. And that's how he was able to evaluate it. There's another topic, and this I picked up because, you mentioned our friend Andrew Sheps, another person of that walk of life, a gentleman by the name of Frank Filippetti, who I've become pretty good friends with. Frank talks about the emotional feeling that you get from the sound of what you're listening to. And this plays into the whole audio processing thing. There's, when you've got it right, it just, there's a feeling about it of where it just comes over you in a really healthy way, a good, positive way. And guys, I'm not talking about, hey, we're 2 dB louder. That's not it. There's a feeling about it that, yes, it might be louder, but if it comes across in a way where it feels good, then you're onto something. And I've had that happen on a number of occasions, both in working with audio processing, also in working, I've developed, and this doesn't apply to FM in the way that we're talking today, but I've come up with a way of upmixing stereo into 5.1 surround, where again, in presenting it to people in the know, they've said, you know what, Frank, not only do I hear it in surround, but there's this emotional richness to what I'm feeling that just makes me want to listen more. And if you're able to do that in the adjustment of signal processing for over the air, you're going to win. Because if you get that emotional attachment, people aren't going to know why they want to listen longer. Yes, content is king. Content is king, and I will never debate that. But what we're doing with the signal processing is in support of that content. And if there's something you can do that's going to further the experience, end of story. Last thing I'll say here on this topic, last year I was honored to be in the documentary movie about Z100, and they talked about, not me, but they talked about the over-the-air sound. And I will tell you guys this, that back in that day, which would be the mid 80s, when the station really, it came on in 83, but the mid 80s, where we really, came to light in the marketplace. If you were to electrically have measured the loudness between Z100 and WPLJ, electrically, PLJ was probably louder. But sonically, Z100 sounded louder because of that thing, about the emotional thing, about trying to let the ear breathe and all that other kind of thing. You'd hit 100.3, it just jumped out of the speakers at you in a loving way. Like Roger Daltrey likes to talk about the music of the Who. It's like getting punched in the nose and somebody telling you, I love you. If you can get your audio processing to do that, game over. Game over. Because now, using that baseball analogy, not only is your leadoff guy on, but the whole lineup is cranking them over the fence. And that's what you want to do. And guys, I'm not talking about just loudness. It's that ethereal feeling. If it gets you and it holds you, it's like, wow, I want to listen to that. And that's what, in radio today, we're if we thought we were fighting for listeners 20 years ago, today it's even, you got this crazy thing and all the services it can provide that, you're fighting for. So what you want to be is you want that signal processing to be there. That's helping to attract and hold on to those listeners.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's an excellent point. And I want to say, I think really when you adjust a processor, you're not really, although you are adjusting it to maybe the program director's desires or something like that, but you should be adjusting it for your audience, your listeners. Andrew, our good friend Andrew, always says it's what comes out of the speaker that counts. And if the listener is not getting an emotional feel of the programming, then that's no matter how the people say it sounds at the station, but you got to do it for the other. I heard a story one time where there was back in the days of when the so-called loudness war was wide open. And I think it was up in the Midwest or somewhere where there were 4 stations that were just battling against each other dB wise. And the engineers, they were really good buddies, and they were having coffee and donuts one day, and they were talking about how aggravating it was getting, because they would come in every morning and the PD or somebody would say, "Oh, you need to bump us up. So Joe down the street is louder than we are. Bump us up, bump us up." Well, they got to talking about that, and one of the engineers said, "I know how we can stop all this craziness." And they said, "What can we do?" They said, "Okay, what about this Thursday? Why don't we go Thursday night, go back,
That's a
all
true
4 of
story.
us, and adjust our processors where they're open and clean and has good intelligibility, and it's not squashed or anything like that, and let's just see what happens." They did that, and as the story goes, that Friday morning, nobody said anything except one PD. And the PD asked the engineer, said, "Did you do anything to the processor last night?" He said, "Yeah, I made a couple little changes." And the PD said, "We've never sound better in our lives. We really sound good." So that's what you're talking about, is get that the quality of it. And I've always been a proponent of quality is much more important than quantity. If you get that and people can listen to it, that's what attracts the listeners.
The products that are available today, every one of them can get you loud. Okay. And I mean, I'm not going to sit here and name competitors. I mean, they all can get you loud. And I can sit here confidently, because we've done it for decades now, that, people, and we're honored over the fact that the amount of people that have chosen our product, and the fact that we've now had, I've taken our product and had it evaluated by people in the know, in the music industry, and they've, given us the thumbs up. So I know that we can generate a competitively loud, competitive. I use the word competitive, and you can say that's being analogous to loudness. I know we can generate a competitive signal, but I also know that we can generate a competitive quality signal. And that's where it's all about. I've laughed, and I will say that I've stopped attending the AES, loudness group, because they've gone way too far the other direction. I mean, you can be competitive and sound good at the same time. You can do that. And I can tell you, because we have all the competitors' products in our shop, and we can select between all of them. And we've got, I have a handful of, pieces of content that is good audio, sonic, like an obstacle course, that at times are been the pieces that we use to develop new stuff so that we can continue to sound better. I can tell you, I can put that on and listen to all the other stuff, like just fall off by the wayside. Yeah, it's competitively loud, but various pieces that should sound like nice tinkling bells sound like, frying eggs or broken glass and things of that nature. And that all ties back to that emotional feeling. Can you get it there? And so in today's day and age, everybody can sound competitive, but can you make it sound the best? And going back in my own days, if it was consulting or when I was in a day-to-day world of radio, I always wanted to be the best sounding on the dial, and it mattered to me. I took it personally. I see one of the guys on the call here because he a great engineer, Andy Butler, from our days in New York. There was a time when things got so crazy in New York, and this was modulation wise. I mean, we used to call up, the engineers over at WPLJ and say, guys, you're doing 125, and they positive, not positive modulation. This wasn't AM, it was FM. And I remember the owner of Z100 said, look, if they don't turn down, then you don't turn down. If they're driving 65 in a 55-mile-an-hour zone and the cops aren't pulling them over, well, then we're going to have to do it too. It got so bad that at an AES convention, I remember, and I'm saying this with respect, Bob Orban was demoing a prototype of his CBS loudness meter. And for some reason, his meter was pinning, and he didn't know why. He was pulling signals off the air. And he was talking to a friend of his who worked in the New York office of the FCC. And the guy said, I know why, because all these guys, and Andy, wasn't you, but, pretty much Z100 and PLJ and probably NEWFM, cranking up the modulation. And the guy said, you know what, get word back to these radio stations that if they don't turn it down in 10 days, fines are going out to each of them. And I don't know if the fine is still, back then it was $10,000 an instance. And we got, I think, a lunch together. My boss asked me to get a lunch together, and we invited all the engineers in New York together for a lunch that Z100 paid for. And we actually even had Dick Sequeira, who's passed on, there to be like the moderator. And we did the same thing. We picked a Sunday night where everybody went back to being, legally modulated, and the government didn't write any fines, but, things got a little bit better, and they stayed, at least during my time, they stayed there, and we all tried to be respectful of one another. And I remember a number of times, connecting up with Andy, there were things that he was over at Hot 100, at the time it was Hot 103, and we were Z100, and we collaborated on some good things, good engineering practice between, our station and their station. So that stuff does matter. It really does.
Yeah, speaking of Andy, he just posted something here. He said at one point in time, a particular processor manufacturer recommended a particular Radio Shack table radio as reliable representation of all receivers for processing adjustment. Do you have any suggestion of what people, what's out there that people can use to monitor off the air?
You know what, guys, I'm, going to feign ignorance here a little bit, because one of the things I've not stayed up on is a lot of the stuff would be used. I think, in my office, I think I still have like an NAD tuner, digital tuner, that I probably bought back in like 1995 or 1990, that I probably replaced, cleaned up the power supply on a few times because the caps dry up. But what's out there today, I honestly don't know. If I'm letting you guys down, I apologize, but I still think back to the stuff that I still have, I turn over here to the side here, I've got a Yamaha tuner and I still have, because when I worked in radio, at home, I had this Heathkit AR-1500 that I built when I was in high school, and I graduated in 1974, and I recapped that a handful of times, and it was a good tuner. It was one of the first that had a phase lock loop, on the in the RF section. But I'm sorry, I don't have something to offer to you guys. I take that back. I have in the office, I have a little portable, the model name escapes me. I have a little portable Sangean, I think it's a Korean company, radio that I use along if I go in the field, and I still use, and I still trust them, my Sony MDR 7506 headphones. Not that I do everything on headphone listening, but if I'm in the field, I at least trust these. And then, I use the radio, such that, you're referencing everything is, everything is relative to the other. So whatever station I'd be working with, how does that sound compared to, whomever the competition is? And again, providing that I'm getting a good RF sampling on all the signals that we're talking about.
I think one of the problems, and I'd like to get your comment on this now, is today it's not like it used to be, where people listen to radio on really good speakers at their home or something. Now it's so diversity. Some people listen like in their cars or on earbuds or their laptops. Is there a way when you are adjusting a processor, do you keep that in mind, or do you just try to adjust the processor where it sounds good on a good system and let whatever they're listening to take care of that?
Well, I think if we're trying to adjust for a specific radio or car, I think that could be self-defeating, because, I recall speaking with, customers over the years that would say, I'm having a problem because I've got to try to get it to sound on the GM such and such model car, and that radio is notorious for not sounding very good, such that if we get it sounding good on that car, then it seems to not sound so good everywhere else. That's why I go back to the reference in the radio station. And I don't mean to segue here, Larry, but I see a question was asked, and it's a good topic to talk about, asking if we'll address the configuration aspect of composite output at the site versus AES into an exciter. In today's world, and I'm happy to talk about it, I've always believed that the composite signal is the best way to get into the exciter. Now, that being said, we have the ability to send composite over an AES link, such that and most of the newer exciters will accept a high sample rate composite signal, generally a sampling rate of 192 kilohertz. And most processors today will output the composite signal in the AES format, such that when that signal going into an exciter that accepts an AES composite input, now you're talking a weapon, because you're going numerically in a linear fashion right into the modulator. And not only the things you'll hear is, the modulation is very tight, and for whatever reason, the low end is extremely strong sounding. I'm not saying strong in the form of that there's more of it, but probably because all the harmonics are being passed through the transmission system in a very linear fashion. It's very tight. Now I'll take it even one step further. We have the ability to transmit composite over a coded link, such that even at a low bit rate of like 384 kilobits, when put into the exciter that'll accept one of those inputs, sounds tremendous. So now, if the question is composite input as compared to AES left and right input, I don't know that I've ever heard an AES left-right input into an exciter that has been able to outperform a composite signal going into the exciter. It's just, most exciters that would incorporate their own stereo generator, okay, they create the, multiplex signal theoretically, but if everything isn't taken into account for preemphasis, low pass filtering, and all else that we have to take into consideration for the composite signal, you can generate overshoots and things of that nature, and then that degrades your signal. So allow the processor to do the composite signal, and in some cases, we're now capable of doing processing in the composite domain that can further enhance the performance of what's on the air.
Yeah, that's a good idea to have. It's always been that way. A good idea to have the stereo generator and the processor all in together, because one complements the other.
Well, not only that, but we have a little trick up our sleeve, as I point to my sleeve, that we call one louder. And that is the ability to embed the pilot. Now, what do I mean by that? In the FM stereo system, the math is 90% program, 10% pilot, such that, if you turn the pilot off, the total modulation meter should sit at 90%. Well, my loving cats who help develop algorithms help me figure something out to where by embedding the pilot, we're able to allow program to go all the way up to 100%, yet the pilot is still injected at 10%, and the total modulation is still at 100. By example, in this format, if you turn the pilot off, the modulation is still at 100%. What does this mean? By being able to have 10% more program, what's 10% more modulation? 1 dB. So you've gained a dB in loudness without changing anything in the processing. And by the way, if you're saying, oh, Frank, you guys are cheating by clipping the pilot, no, we're not. If you clip the pilot, yes, you'd be able to do it, but you'd be extinguishing the pilot. But we're not doing that. We're embedding the pilot in a manner where, and I don't have it here to share on the screen, but what you would see is if we brought it up and we did it with a tone, you'd see the tone go all the way up to 100%. The pilot would still be there. And on a spectrum analyzer, the pilot would be sitting at 19 kilohertz, nothing around it in the sense of, there's no clipping. It's because it's been embedded. And by being able to do that, we're able to deliver 1 dB more. That's why we call it one louder. We're able to deliver 1 dB more in loudness in a legal fashion. That would be the same as if you overmodulated by 10% in the old, in the old manner of speaking.
There is a system out, and maybe it's the Omni, I don't remember, that will actually, the pilot will turn on and off between stereo audio and mono. Is that correct, or am I just imagining that?
No, I think my colleague Leif Clayson has an option in the Omnia 9, which will allow you to dynamically turn the pilot on and off. Something to be careful there is that, there may be certain radios that if they're not detecting the pilot might misbehave a little bit. So my sense is, if the pilot's there, the pilot's there. I've always kind of leaned towards keeping the pilot on.
I had assumed that the reason they were doing that is not so much for loudness, but multipath, because sometimes with the pilot on or stereo, multipath in a large city gets to be a problem. Is that accurate statement?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. If you've got a true mono signal and the pilot's there, well, your spectra is really just audio out to 15 kilohertz, the little pilot sitting there at 19. Yes, it's going to, tell the decoder in the radio to act like it's stereo. And if there's noise in the sub channel, the 23 to 53 kilohertz area, yeah, that might print. But, I guess, it comes down to a matter of taste. It's something that if you have that feature in your processor and you wish to use it, and there's no known negative effects to any radios, then, who am I to say yes or no? But generally speaking, I guess it does come down to, if you're in some sketchy signal area and there is a lot of known multipath, if it does make a difference, well, in some ways, Larry, the analogy I'll offer you is, those that wish to run, FM stereo with single sideband suppressed carrier as compared to double sideband suppressed carrier. I laugh because it's been the fans of competitors that say, Frank, that's hocus pocus. Yet we have a laundry list of customers who've said, we've gone to single sideband and FM stereo, and we've got certain areas where we had difficult areas to pick up our signal, which is now listenable. So again, who am I to say that it's right or it's wrong? If the empirical evidence is there, then do it.
Sure. In the few minutes we got left here, what is your thought about the future of processing? I know we've got several things that are, as you talked about a while ago, 5.1 sound, and now we've got Atmos, and then we've got this thing called LUFS, the LUFS. Where do you see processing going in the future?
Well, as long as the analog system is going to remain, FM stereo in the way that we know it, and I think it will, we're always trying to push the envelope with regard to, can we deliver more quality to the listeners? Can we deliver surround sound? Yes. Steve Church and I, we came up with a way to do that. Sadly, the industry chose, not to do it, but that doesn't mean it can't happen again. Like I say, I developed an up mixer that provides an amazing, realistic 5.1 surround sound. So could that be done? Yes. I think in the near term, the thing to be aware of, and that we're seeing this occur in broadcasting, is, and we'll continue to make a physical box. An Omnia processor will continue to exist in the physical box. It's also migrating into the software, into the soft domain, be it running on a server farm or in a container or something of that nature. I think in the near future, that's what you're going to see. Is there's some broadcasters that we're seeing more of this, that is becoming a requirement, and domestically and internationally. We recently just spent a week having discussions with people that represent our organization, and some of them have said, oh yes, this is the future. And then we've had others that have said, but do not forget, there's a large contingent out there that they still want to have a box, even though the box is running software that can be running in a cloud somewhere. Their comfort level is knowing that they have a box. And that's, and I get that. I've been probably more the dyed-in-the-wool guy within the Telos Alliance that said, look, don't forget those people that want a box. And it's not because that might be the way I would go or not, but I know and I respect that aspect for the marketplace.
Sure. Well, Frank, we appreciate you being with us today. It's always enjoyable to have you, and And there's a lot of information that you impart to people that's on our program, and processing is one of those things that's going to be here forever. And like you say, either in a box or in the cloud or wherever it happens to be. And the deal is people just need to keep up with what's going on
Yep.
to do it correctly. So thanks again. I
Thank
appreciate
you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for inviting me, and the best to all you guys.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, reminder to everybody that this program has been recorded, and it will be available on our YouTube site, which is just go to YouTube and search ABA Engineering Academy, and you'll see not only this one, but all the ones that we've done over the years, plus some videos that we do at the Engineering Academy. Our next webinar, we will not have one next month because of the NAB convention going on at that time. So our next engineering webinar is scheduled for May 16th. So make sure you make a note of that and join us then. So thank everybody for watching, and we'll see you again in May.